Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the final installment of our 2023 Charging Infrastructure webinar series. We're super excited to have you on here for an exciting discussion. My name is Alyssa Lenkel. For those of you who don't know me, I am an EV Infrastructure Associate at the Electrification Coalition. And today we will be talking about charging at multifamily dwellings. Now, at-home charging access is vital for EV ownership, as many of you know, since many EV drivers charge at home, and for many, reliance solely on nearby public charging is not always going to be reliable and something they can sustain for the many years that they live at that residence. So today we have folks from all over the industry that will be walking us through policy and advocacy priorities to prioritize charging at multifamily dwellings, installation solutions that work for residents, and real-life lessons learned from charging at multifamily dwelling programs that are taking place today. As always, feel free to put the Q&A in the chat or in the Q&A box, but we have a pretty full schedule, so I want to get right to it, and we can always pass questions along to the speaker after the fact and get you guys connected that way. So up first, we have Stan Cross. He is the Electric Transportation Policy Director at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Stan's decade of experience in the electric transportation trenches demonstrates that developing innovative and supportive state, municipal, and utility policies is central to unlocking the electric transportation market. Stan's leadership has been recognized by the US DOE Clean Cities Partner Award and the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association Clean Energy Business Community Initiative Award. Stan currently serves in a leadership capacity to the Southeast Electric Transportation Regional Initiative, Georgia's Electric Mobility Innovation Alliance, Drive Electric Florida, Plug-in North Carolina, South Carolina's Electric Vehicle Stakeholder Initiative, and Drive Electric Tennessee. Previously, Stan led and co-founded Brightfield Transportation Solutions, a startup that designs and deploys solar integrated electric vehicle charging stations. Stan also serves as a transportation electrification consultant for the cities of Raleigh and Charlotte, North Carolina, and the Energy Foundation. We're so excited to have Stan a part of this conversation. So Stan, take it away.
Well, thank you, Alyssa. Appreciate that introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. Excited to be talking about EV charging at multi-unit dwellings. So, I want to start our conversation today just with some high-level context. And for level-setting purposes, I think it's really important that we're all aware of what's happening in the personal electric vehicle market. And what this graph shows is sort of the steady growth in market share of electric vehicles. That's the percentage of electric vehicles that are sold, new vehicles, in the context of all auto sales. And what's of note this year is that we crossed another important threshold, which is that 10% market share level. That means nationwide, 1 out of every 10 light-duty vehicles purchased today is an electric vehicle. And that's important because as market share increases, there's an exponential growth factor that begins to kick in. As more vehicles are bought, more vehicles are noticed by neighbors, that spawns more purchasing. And with any disrupted technology like electric vehicles, there's a steady adoption curve that everything follows. And we're beginning to see EVs reach that point where growth is no longer linear, but now exponential. And so that's important because when we think about multi-unit dwellings and EV charging at multi-unit dwellings, we're not thinking about that in a vacuum or in some future scenario. We're talking about it in a market that's happening right now. And that 10% market share, though, California and New York and other states like those two have been leading the way over the years, what you see in this image is that, it's happening all across the country. We've got 10 states now that are above that 10% market share. And where I live here in the Southeast, we're over 7% and growing really quickly. So everywhere in the country, EVs are being purchased by consumers. And the question about how do we make sure that that opportunity for those who want to own an EV is equitable and accessible is really what brings us to this conversation today. So as Alyssa was alluding to at the top of the webinar, EV charging happens at home, right? That's where it takes place. And, when you're able to charge at home, that charging experience is convenient, it's reliable, and it's low cost. And if we want to achieve equitable accessibility, it won't happen until everyone, including people living in multi-unit dwellings, have the same access that I do to enjoy convenience, reliability, and cost savings. Every day I come home in my EV, I pull up in my driveway, which you see right here in the picture, and I plug in my car. I wake up in the morning and that car is fully charged and ready to go. And my electricity bill only sees an increase of about $30 a month. That makes the experience affordable and convenient. That brings joy to the experience. And if you don't have that, then you really aren't going to have accessibility. So I just think it's really important when we're talking about multi-unit dwellings that we acknowledge that the goal is for everyone, including the 36% of residences that are multi-unit dwellings, have access to this convenience, reliability, and affordability. And how we get there from where we are now, and where we are now is that equitable accessibility does not exist, that living in multi-unit dwellings means you don't, by and large, have access to convenient, reliable, and low-cost EV charging. There are things that we can do, and there are things that are being done, and we're going to hear some of these, spoken about from our other panelists. But I just wanted to acknowledge that these three bullets represent moves that can be made right now. On municipal levels, there are cities, and we'll hear some today, that are working to develop different strategies around EV-ready codes and ordinances, making it so that new multi-unit dwelling structures that are being built are prepared to enable home charging. At the same time, there's opportunities for local governments to look at strategies for retrofitting, right? Existing multi-unit dwellings and how we make things attractive for the property managers to incorporate EV charging. Utility make-ready programs is a really wonderful opportunity where they exist, and they can exist in more places with additional advocacy and work with utilities and commissioners. But where utilities are working with property owners, working with local governments to make sure that as things are constructed and as people need EV charging, the utilities are showing up and taking care of bringing the power to the charger, which removes a lot of uncertainty from the process and also helps keep costs down for property owners. And I think what's probably most important for us to recognize is that the developers of multi-unit dwellings and the managers of these properties, we can't assume that they understand the need for EV charging on their properties, or they understand the benefit that providing EV charging delivers to their residents. There's a lot of need for education and outreach, and groups like Southern Alliance for Clean Energy can help with that. But cities that want to see their citizens living in multi-unit dwellings having access to EV charging can play a really important role in that education as well, as can state agencies and all stakeholders involved in this process. So I just want to lay out that context for us as we dive in deeper with Josh and the Sarahs talking about how it's actually getting done and how we're getting EV charging at multi-unit dwellings. So I look forward to continuing the conversation, and I'll be around for Q&A if anybody has any questions. Back to you, Alyssa.
Great. Thanks so much, Stan. That was a really awesome level set. And 36% of residences are mud is huge. I mean, it hits close to home for me because I live in a multi-unit dwelling, but 36%, that's crazy that, we need to take action on getting reliable charging at these multi-unit dwellings for sure. So next, to give us some more insight on installation strategy and best practices for installing at multi-unit dwellings, we have Josh Cohen, the head of policy at Switch Energy. So Josh leads policy and regulatory strategy and engagement for Switch. And in this role, he participates in legislative and regulatory proceedings and collaborates with industry stakeholders to shape policy and move the market forward. His priorities include expanding equitable access to electric transportation and delivering benefits to drivers, property owners, and the grid through software-based managed charging, open protocols, and interoperability. Prior to Switch, Josh served in policy roles at Shell Recharge Solutions, SEMA Connect, and the Business Network for Offshore Wind. Josh previously served in the public sector leadership roles, including as mayor of Annapolis and as deputy administrator of the Rural Utility Service during the Obama administration. Based in Annapolis, Josh holds an MS in Energy Policy and Climate from Johns Hopkins and a BA in Economics from the University of Maryland. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Josh.
Great, thank you, Alyssa. And can everyone hear me okay? I will assume so. Great, thank you. Okay. So just one slide about Switch. Switch got its start about 7 years ago when the guy who became our founder, Carter Lee, he was living in a condominium. He wanted to buy an electric vehicle, went to his condo board, researched it, asked if he could install a charger, asked if they could help with it, asked if he could take care of the whole thing, and basically was told no. And he said, this is not okay. People who live in condos and other multifamily buildings need the ability to be able to charge EVs. And so 7 years later, Switch has become one of the leading EV charging solutions providers in North America, and with a particular focus on the multi-tenant space, in particular, multifamily residential. That remains our sweet spot. So Stan did a nice job of kind of teeing up the multifamily charging conversation and identifying some key themes. As Stan mentioned, there are a number of unique challenges that multifamily properties face when it comes to installation and management of EV charging. This picture is obviously a real picture of a combination telecom electrical room in one of the multifamily buildings that is a customer of ours. And as you can see, this building was probably built a few decades ago and filled in over time and is now literally a jumble of wires and circuits. And so this is a very common type of environment in which property owners are now trying to think about, okay, how do we install chargers? So some of the challenges include higher installation costs, particularly for retrofitting existing buildings. As Stan was saying, the cost to go in and retrofit can be easily 4 times higher or more to go back in after the fact. Electrical capacity constraints is a very real challenge. Even if I live in a condo unit and I'm paying for all the electricity that my vehicle is going to use at my charger, it's all of the electricity in the condo building or apartment building still ultimately have to be served by the master panel or panels for the building itself. So how do you manage that overall electrical capacity? And this photo on the right side is an actual panel sheet for another one of our customers. And as you can see, they were facing this similar problem. How do we fit in this new load for EVs on top of all of our existing load? Multifamily buildings have much more layers of decision-making authority, particularly if you're talking about an apartment building where the property manager may not even be the owner of the building, where the individual household who wants the EV is just renting and may not be there a year from now. There's technical complexity around the installation, not just in terms of the electrical load, but also there are telecoms and communications issues if you're dealing with networked chargers. There's business model uncertainty around who's actually going to own these, who are they going to be for, how are they going to be used. And at the end of the day, as with many questions and challenges, it comes down to who's going to pay for this. And so as the saying goes, at the heart of every challenge is an opportunity. There are opportunities and solutions for all of these. And I'm only going to touch on a very few just for purposes of this slide presentation. But 3 high-level points I'd like to emphasize are as follows. The first one is to focus on installing software-based chargers upfront, network chargers. Software unlocks a whole host of value streams for the owners, everything from the ability to manage the electricity, save money on the electricity and on the charging, the ability to fit more chargers in on a given circuit, and customizable access, pricing, and billing for the users. Another key theme is interoperability. Communication protocols are a really important part of the EV charging ecosystem, which is really a lot more than just delivering the electricity. It's really a telecom and a digital communications world that makes it all work when you think about the vehicle, connecting to the charger, connecting to the cloud, and connecting to, in many cases, the utility, and receiving and sending signals to the utility. The ability for all of those different components of the EV ecosystem to communicate and speak the same language seamlessly is really important, and open communication protocols enable that interoperability. And then the third key theme is EV-ready building codes, which Stan mentioned and which I'll touch on briefly. So I'm just going to dive right into this at a very high level to introduce some of these concepts. When it comes to load management, this is not a new concept in a number of other uses. But when it comes to EVs, it's the ability to manage load, manage the electricity on the system, on a circuit, so that you can manage when and how vehicles charge and how much power they draw at a given time. This diagram, if you look at the top image, this is a representative charger on a circuit that, not to get too technical, 240-volt, 40-amp circuit can deliver a maximum output of 9.6 kilowatts. If you are not managing the load, then you can have one charger charging at that maximum. But if you're able to manage the load and share the charging among the chargers, among multiple chargers on that circuit, then just realistically, but this is just representative, you could have up to 4 chargers all charging simultaneously at 2.4 kilowatts on that same circuit. So this is an example of how the ability to manage charging enables you to install multiple chargers on a single circuit. And more importantly, it enables the ability to manage the charging demand from EVs within the context of the building overall. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to present an illustrated graph showing the overall building load over the course of a day and how EV charging can relate to that. So in this graph, and I'll explain it, the x-axis represents 24 hours in a day from midnight to midnight. And then the y-axis, as you move up, represents the amount of kilowatts, the amount of power. And so the gray represents the non-EV load, the green and the red represent the EV load, and this horizontal line at the top is whatever threshold or constraint you have, whether it's in a lot of cases panel capacity, or in some cases the desire to avoid demand charges. So if you look at the green load curves, you have baseline load, which is just even when the building is basically dormant. This is just the electricity that it's going to be using. Then you have HVAC and lighting. Then you have residential load. And as you can see, for those, you can see the load increase around 4 or 5 or 6 at night when people come home from work or school. They turn on the microwave, they turn on the iron, turn on the dryer, and you can see where there's that evening peak. And then if you consider folks who have EVs, they come home and they also plug in the EVs, which can draw a lot of electricity. You can easily see how that load, when, again, even if I, as the driver, am paying for my own electricity within the constraints of the overall building load, you can easily see how that EV load on top of all the other load can exceed the panel capacity. And so if you think about managing the charging, like in the graphic I showed earlier, it's not just about sharing chargers on a single circuit. It's also about delaying when these vehicles charge. And you can do that with software so that the driver sets it and forgets it, just like a smart thermostat where you say, I want it at 72 degrees, and then the thermostat does the work in the background. So here, same scenario, the green represents the same volume of electricity as the green and red in the earlier graphic, but just very simply, you can see how by managing the load intelligently with software, it automatically shifts a lot of the charging to the early hours of the morning when there's ample capacity in the building. Excuse me. The second high-level point, excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink of water. The second high-level point is the interoperability piece, and I'm not going to dig into this, and you don't need to understand the details of all of these, but if you've been in conversations around EVs and EV charging, you've no doubt heard of some of these acronyms. And so this slide explains what these acronyms are and which pieces of the communications within the EV ecosystem they cover. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'll be happy to go into it more if there are questions, but just to give you some basic familiarity, these are 4 of the key open communication protocols. This slide is a visual representation of the text on the previous slide, and it's intended to show visually how the different communication protocols connect different elements of the EV ecosystem. And so the final of the 3 kind of best practices I wanted to emphasize are EV-ready parking requirements, construction codes, building codes. This very handy graphic I actually stole from Stan's organization, the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. When it comes to EV-ready parking requirements or building codes, there's different levels of EV readiness that people talk about, ranging on the left from EVSE capable, which means there's not an actual charger, there's not even wiring and a parking space, but the building does have enough capacity built in to accommodate future charging, and it has the conduit or raceways going to the parking spaces to make it easier to wire those spaces when the time comes. So you have a range from EVSE capable to EVSE ready, which does include the wiring and goes up to a junction box or an outlet, to actually EVSE installed, where you have a charger already installed at the time of construction, ready to go. And so if you are an official in a municipality or a county, or even in some cases a state, and you're thinking about how do I make my state building code or my local zoning code include EV readiness, a common approach is to follow the model codes that are put out by the ICC, the International Code Council. This slide shows 3 of the most common ones: the International Building Code, the International Residential Code, and most relevant to this conversation is the IECC, the International Energy Conservation Code. These model codes are developed and revised every 3 years through a wide-ranging stakeholder process. The 2024 update or 2024 edition of the IECC, we expect to be published in just a month or 2 in Q1 of 2024. And my expectation is that this 2024 version will include EV-ready parking provisions for different types of buildings, including multifamily. And so if you are, again, if you're a local official, if you're a state official, a lot of times it's a 2-step process where the ICC publishes its code, but the local jurisdiction still needs to affirmatively adopt the code. And so the key point is to not only adopt the 2024 version of the IECC, but to ensure that you or your jurisdiction adopts it in full, including the EV-ready provisions that I expect will be in there. So those are 3 high-level best practices. Just some closing thoughts are, again, multifamily charging is critically important if we are going to ensure equitable EV adoption. 3 key tools include software-enabled managed charging, interoperability, and EV-ready construction codes. And as a final thought, there are a lot of federal and utility incentives that can be available. And if you're a community official, a state, a county, a city, having a plan for EV adoption and ensuring compliance in that plan with some of the requirements of federal incentives and utility programs can unlock a lot of funding support. So those are my slides. I appreciate being part of this. And Alyssa, I will turn it back over to you for the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. Thank you so much for breaking down that technical stuff into those real easy to digest figures, and also the real world example that you don't need a whole new facility to do this. And those installers are able to work with the property to make this happen is really great to hear. So thank you so much. And now we're going to shift gears a little bit because a lot of what we've covered today may sound easier said than done, but cities across the country are taking these actions to prioritize charging in multi-unit dwellings in their city plans today. So to demonstrate this a bit further, we have Sarah Hazel, the Chief Sustainability and Resilience Officer at the City of Charlotte, and Sarah Gardner, the Climate Action Coordinator at Iowa City. So Sarah is the city's first Chief Sustainability and Resilience Officer, where she leads a team to deliver on the city's mission to become a low-carbon, sustainable city. She worked in the Charlotte City Manager's Officer for over 6 years, where she worked on special projects, strategic initiatives, and policy and program development. And prior to her work with the city, she spent 7 years running national campaigns for a missions-based consulting firm specializing in grassroots fundraising and advocacy, including a variety of environmental organizations. She received a bachelor's degree in government English and her master's in public administration from UNC Chapel Hill. And Sarah Gardner is the Climate Action Coordinator for the City of Iowa City. She graduated from the University of Iowa with a master's in urban and regional planning and has led many projects focused on electric vehicle readiness, alternative energy, transit and active transportation, recycling, and climate preparedness in Iowa and Illinois. Previously a journalist covering sustainability and climate change, Sarah has authored many articles on climate resilience and is a dedicated advocate for creating communities that are healthy, equitable, and engaging places to live. So we brought them both on today to ask them a few questions about how they're implementing charging and multi-unit dwelling work in their city planning and to learn some best practices for next steps. So, hi, Sarah and Sarah, great to have you. To kind of introduce yourselves and give us an overview, our first question is actually, what is your city doing in multi-unit dwellings and EV infrastructure work?
We didn't really work out which of the Sarahs was going to go first in these questions. Why don't I defer to Sarah Hazel since you introduced her first?
Sounds great. Thank you. And thanks for the wonderful introduction. Here in the city of Charlotte, you know, we have a pretty aggressive set of goals to be in support of decarbonizing our community. Obviously, transportation is about 40% of our emissions. And so looking at how we can support EV infrastructure has been a really big priority for us for the last several years. And then likewise, our embedded in all of our goals are equity as a principle. And so I think the way that Stan teed up the conversation talking about how are we really looking at how we can provide charging for people who otherwise would not have an opportunity to charge. And we know that folks who live in multifamily really have a real challenge ahead of them. And so what we can do as a city has been really important. And in particular, one of the things that we most recently did was pass an EV ready ordinance, part of a big ordinance package that our city just implemented in June and adopted over a year ago. And so we do two things. We work to ensure that there's a level of EV capability and then EV install in our multifamily units. And then that also applies to residential component of mixed use developments, hotels, parking lots, parking structures. But then beyond that EV capability and EV install, we have a bonus structure so that if interested, developers can do more and then they can be able to build higher with that additional bonus structure. So we try to do two things, sort of the requirement at a basic level and then incentivize further.
Yeah, I will just say, similar to Charlotte, we also have built into our code EV readiness requirements and have been, actually our Planning and Zoning Commission has been calling for and investigating EV install requirements to up those. But the other end of that for the city of Iowa City is that we offer a grant for multifamily unit dwellings to help support the installation of electric vehicle charging at their facilities. And this is for condos and apartments. When it was originally designed, it was in part in response to a gap we saw through utility incentives, which would cover the cost of the equipment with a fairly nice rebate. But what we were hearing from many area landlords, and this is true, I think, for many buildings, the equipment costs are often dwarfed by the installation costs. And so it's the trenching and boring and the running of conduit that can end up being the more significant barrier. So what the city of Iowa City did was develop a grant that would be a 50-50 cost share on the cost of installation that could be paired with the utilities grant to cover the equipment in full as a way to bring the cost down. Now, since we implemented that, the utility decided to get out of the business of providing rebates for the equipment, which triggered the city revising our grant so that now it's a 50-50 cost share that covers both the installation cost and the equipment costs for charging equipment.
Great, thanks so much. And you both kind of alluded to my next question, but I will dig a little bit deeper on it. Specifically, a lot of times on these webinars, we like to ask about first steps, maybe for cities who haven't gotten started and want to get started with that. So in terms of policy, you had both mentioned EV ordinances. Do you think that's kind of the first step? Or Sarah Gardner, I know you mentioned the grant. Do you think that was more effective and might be a harder ask? So there's like a step one to get there. What is kind of your involvement with policy work, and what have you found makes it easier to install EV infrastructure in multi-unit dwellings?
Sarah, I can jump in first on this one too. So, you know, we spent a lot of time looking at different ordinances across the country. And so really, I think our first step, at least internally, was to look at what's out there and look at what some of the best practices were, attending webinars like this, for example. But what we really did during the process leading up to the ordinance adoption was hear from multifamily developers and understand what their challenges were. And I think, to reiterate some of the things that we've already heard, it really does kind of all come down to the money. And so what we ended up doing was having a series of conversations, looking at what some of the additional costs would be, and revising our ordinance to hear some of what we heard from them and to reflect that back into an ordinance. And at that point, that's when we decided to also develop a bonus structure so that we could ensure that, and in particular, at affordable housing developments where our folks are trying to do as much as they can to make money go as far as they can. And affordable housing is obviously a big priority for the city of Charlotte. And so hearing specifically their concerns, but ensuring that we were working with them to get the ordinance to a place where everybody could move forward, and then working to connect them with some of the opportunities that exist when it comes to make ready credits and to I think the point that Sarah G made, ensure that they are kind of connected to additional resources that could go a step farther. So it was a multi-step process, but a lot of engagement with some of the developers in the beginning.
Yeah, I would echo that and say it's really not an either or question. Either you go after the code and policy portion of it, or you go after the grant funding. I mean, really, we're talking about two different kinds of buildings here. And by that, I don't mean apartments and condos, but existing and future housing stock, right? Putting it into your codes is a great way to address the future housing stock, but the existing housing stock is always going to be a more significant piece of the puzzle in any community. I will say that similar to what Sarah Hazel has shared, I think for us, the real first step was engaging landlords in the conversation. We actually built this request into an EV readiness plan that we had participated in regionally, where we asked very specifically that there be a carve-out section looking at multifamily housing and that the consultant conduct a number of interviews with landlords that we then sat in on. And, you know, the surprising thing that really came out of that is we tend to think of this as a very technical issue, you know, that the questions are going to be, what level of charging do I need? What do I need to do in terms of my electrical panel upgrade? But landlords had some real nuts and bolts questions that I think would have been entirely off the radar were it not for those interviews. And those were questions like, if somebody who doesn't have an EV parks in the parking spot, is the city going to come and support us in towing them away? How do you keep people who don't live in the apartment complex from using your charger? Or conversely, we had a landlord who wanted to know how could he encourage people from the neighborhood to come in and use it because he wanted to serve as a neighborhood charging hub. And even just basic questions of where do I put it? You know, folks were looking at the far end of their parking lot thinking that this EV drivers were going to be in the minority, so it made the sense to park them furthest away until they figured out what it would cost in terms of trenching and boring to get it there. So even some just basic consultation on best practices of where to put EV charging was really helpful. And I will say, I think the grant that we've offered has been extremely helpful in continuing those conversations. In terms of the dollars paid out, it's been fairly limited, but just having those conversations with landlords, one of the things we've learned is that you really need to engage your landlords multiple times before they're ready to move forward on installing charging. So it's best to just get started with those conversations now.
Yes, for sure. And engaging landlords and also giving them that space, you know, to ask those questions is super important, like you highlighted, because if you just come at them with all of the technical stuff, some of them might be too, you know, afraid to speak up and ask those questions. So that's really great that you were able to provide that. So speaking of collaboration, we're going to shift a little bit from landlords and talk about another key player that we are always engaging with in terms of installing EVSE. So that's utilities. So what role did your utility play in any of your implementation EVSE plans at multi-unit dwellings?
So one thing that we did was also engage our utility during the development of our ordinance. And so that was really helpful to make sure we were using language that everybody was in agreement with, because we know that, you know, once this ordinance went live and folks who were getting into this space for the first time, they were going to have a role working with our utility, Duke Energy. And so, you know, on a very project by project basis, it was just really important that they knew this was coming, but also that, you know, we were all kind of speaking from the same sheet. And then, as I mentioned before, I mean, really trying to make sure that we connect folks with the incentives that exist from our utility. And one of the things that we've tried to do as a city, you know, I work in sustainability, we're the Office of Sustainability, but work with our housing department. And so for folks who might be working in cities, we have really tried to engage them early, so that they can also engage their partners in the community. And I think that has proven itself pretty effective, both not only engaging with their partners, but also knowing who some of the key players are, like the utilities. And so, you know, we obviously work hand in hand with Duke Energy. They are our utility. And one of the other, I guess, key pieces I would note is that we have a couple MOUs with them that help facilitate some of these conversations. One is to work towards a sustainable energy transition. And what we have found is that when we have issues that we need to elevate, so maybe it's around an ordinance or you know, a apartment complex, we can't get some things unstuck, we can work together to make sure that you know, there's a person that can be responsive on the other end. And so those types of partnerships and kind of creating some communication lines that might not otherwise exist have been helpful in this space and in several other spaces. And then I think in addition to that, it's helped us with some pilots with them around EV charging, not in multi-unit dwellings, but next to multi-unit dwellings, connected to light poles that serve the same population. And we think that has been a pretty interesting pilot to make sure that folks who again don't have the access because they're in existing multi-unit dwellings, and there's no charging available, that there can be the gap filled with some of these other alternatives like on-street charging.
Similarly, we're in regular conversation with the utility provider here, both to be aware of their incentives. We always ask for updates at the beginning of the year when they're sending them out, and what they anticipate carrying forward into the new year and what they don't. But I would say even more critically, when we were first developing our grant program, we started with a conversation with the utility to make sure that if a resident participated in our grant program, it wouldn't disqualify them from participating in the utility. That's something you always have to be mindful of anytime you have something that is meant to be paired with the utility program. Sometimes they aren't stackable, so we wanted to make sure we were designing it in such a way that it could be. And our utility was very supportive throughout the process, which is wonderful. And we welcome the day when they reinstitute their grant for equipment. That would be great too. We continue the conversation in hopes that that might be possible.
Great. Yeah, for sure. Another unique and interesting collaboration that you have to approach in a thoughtful way, for sure. So thank you so much for that insight. Next, I wanted to pivot to something that's not always fun to talk about, but can really be a great teaching moment for cities trying to replicate your process. So any challenges and barriers that you encountered along the way that you, having the knowledge you have now, would have approached differently or might have learned from? It's a bit of a broad question, but yeah, anything that you think you could share with other cities so that they can avoid potential roadblocks that you didn't foresee.
Yeah, I mean, I think more communication tools up front. Everybody is trying to do really great things, but sometimes the conversation could be really technical, and sometimes it could be really not technical, like how do you enforce parking? From the city's perspective, we can answer some of those questions from experience, because we've been a little bit ahead of where our community is with our own fleet, with some of our parking decks, those types of things. And so one of my lessons learned is that we can spend more time on either putting together information that's clear and can answer some of the more technical questions, but also some of the basic FAQs that we're hearing that are not very technical, but are very common, and have that prepared as we go into the conversation and into some of these conversations, or just connect them with resources that already exist a little bit better. And so I think we continue to think about that, and how we better prepare materials that just help people do something that is new, so it feels hard, but maybe some of the answers actually aren't that difficult.
I'd say on our end, when we began engaging with landlords, originally we envisioned the program as being entirely focused on level 2 charging. And one of the things that I was just truly surprised to learn is how many condo associations and apartment buildings had indoor parking provided, but it was not wired even with a basic 120-volt outlet. And so what we started hearing from the condos in particular is that they weren't quite ready to leap into the level 2 charging, partly because of just questions of owned parking stalls. But they were starting to see members who were buying EVs and coming with the trickle chargers that they had nowhere to plug in. And so one of the requests we got was, it's really great that you're offering level 2 charging. Would it be possible to pair it with some basic support to help support level 1 charging? Just putting in those outlets and a couple other stalls so that we can accommodate as many residents as possible. And that was something we were quite happy to do to tweak the program, but again, was totally not on our radar until we started talking to those landlords.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So my final question for you, again, to kind of relate this back to other cities' applications, a lot of cities are making those decarbonization plans. How do you fit EV infrastructure at multi-unit dwellings into an overall decarbonization plan to really drive home that message?
Yeah, that's been, I think, a really great opportunity that we've had. The city we have a strategic energy action plan. We have a strategic mobility plan. Lots of plans, many plans that the city has. But you know, we have goals around shifting modes, getting people onto transportation. One thing that I found is that this shouldn't feel like a battle of the modes, internally or externally, to our sustainability advocates, partners, and community. And so we've really thought about how we can pair some of the opportunities for mode shift. We have a pilot, which is a e-bike pilot that's focused with one of our housing developers, and we're really excited about that, and also excited about pairing that with a partnership that we have with Fourth and SACE and housing developers, housing partners, to put EV car share in the same areas. So how can we look at this as complementary versus in competition towards our overall goal of decarbonization, which does include getting people out of cars, or getting people into shared cars, in addition to ensuring that we know that there's going to be people driving, and certainly there will still be people driving alone, and how do we fit that infrastructure into it? And then even beyond that, how do we ensure that the infrastructure isn't in competition? And so we really thought about that when we think about, you know, maybe all of the EV charging that's available to the public doesn't need to be in the right of way. We have other uses like bike lanes, and that are really important towards our overall decarbonization goals. But then how can we think about these opportunities like retrofitting multifamily, parking lots, parking areas, so that we can fill that gap that's needed, while being complementary with the other efforts that are so needed to create a low carbon city. So a lot of good thinking around that, and kind of alignment of plans and efforts, and more to come and more to do.
Here in Iowa City, we're very fortunate to be served by a utility that has been fairly progressive in its embrace of renewable energy. Iowa is a wind-rich state in terms of energy resources. And our utility, as it has approached its stated goal of achieving 100% renewable energy, has just created a really nice opportunity for us to talk about electrification as a next step, right? When we look at our greenhouse gas inventory that we do annually, we can see that we're rapidly approaching a plateau. That is the result of that utility building out its renewable infrastructure. And so we can say, you know, if we want to go lower than this, it means we have to start taking advantage of that clean energy in the maximum way possible. And electric vehicles are a key strategy to doing that. And I'll say, similar to Charlotte, we also view this as an all of the above modal strategy. You know, we aren't putting all our eggs in the EV basket. We're also looking at supporting transit use, increasing biking and walking in the community. We're very fortunate to live in a community where people bike and walk to work at rates higher than the national average. And similarly, we have fairly high transit usage, but like many transit systems, we it got a hit from the pandemic with people getting off the bus. So two things that we've done recently is begin moving toward electrifying our fleet of buses, which has been just the best ambassador actually that we have for electric vehicles. People love seeing the electric buses on the street. We get a lot of questions about the buses themselves that have then turned into more questions about electric vehicles and how can people get them for personal use. And we've also made our transit system free for everybody to use, which has significantly increased our transit ridership by about 50%, which means we have a whole lot more people getting on those electric buses and experiencing that technology firsthand. So all of these strategies work together to help us forward the adoption of electric vehicles across our modes and help bring down our emissions.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really great to hear how you guys are fitting it into your decarbonization plans, even with the unique intricacies of each city and kind of the places that you overlap. Should be super helpful for other cities to kind of use you guys as guidance to go ahead and do this themselves. So with our final few minutes here, I wanted to invite the rest of the panelists up for some audience Q&A. We got some really great questions, and I wanted to direct the first Two came from the audience that were directed towards Stan and Josh. So it'll give the Sarahs a chance to catch their breath after that rapid fire Q&A I just gave them. But feel free to chime in if you feel like you have an answer or something you need to add. These just came in during those presentations. So the first question we had was, for Stan, do you have examples of municipal EV make-ready codes and ordinances for cities trying to influence new policies?
Yes, I mean, there are really good examples. I mean, there are, a few states in the country where, this conversation is happening at state level and where good actions are happening there, California being kind of the gold standard right now. But there are a lot of activities at the local government level. And what we do at Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is we have a website called Electrify the South. You can go to at electrifythesouth.org, and there you'll find our electric transportation toolkit. And we gather case studies and best practices from around the country to help local governments kind of move through all the processes of electrifying, from getting EV charging at multi-unit dwellings like we're talking about today, to electrifying fleets, to doing effective community engagement, and to realizing equitable outcomes. So that toolkit, electrifythesouth.org, does list a number of cities. We'll be updating that over the course of the next month, but right now you can see examples of EV-ready policies from a number of cities in Florida, including Orlando, Miami-Dade County, Coral Gables, and Miami, as well as Leon County, where Tallahassee is. You can also find models from the city of Charlotte and their approach to dealing with this issue, as well as Atlanta, Georgia, and others. So go there and check it out, and hopefully those examples will help you.
Great, thanks so much. And I believe we shared that resource in the chat too, so folks watching should be able to access that. The next question that we had come in from the audience was for Josh. Do you approach your electrification efforts focusing on bi-directional capabilities?
So I get a lot of questions about bi-directional charging, vehicle to grid, vehicle to building, V to G, V to X. And Switch does do, we do currently have a few bi-directional charging pilots, but by and large, when it comes to the multifamily charging space overall, bi-directional is not a big focus. There are a few use cases when it comes to vehicle electrification that a lot of folks are focusing on as kind of ready today, and it makes a lot of sense economically as well for bi-directional, like school bus charging, where the school buses are basically on the road a couple times a day, but are otherwise sitting stationary, and they have much larger batteries. But when it comes to multifamily charging, personally, I would not make bi-directional a main focus. I would make managed charging a big focus, just for some of the reasons I and other panelists have talked about. There's so much value that is not being claimed when folks are installing chargers in multifamily properties without thinking about software-enabled managed charging.
Yeah, well said, for sure. But yeah, bi-directional charging is, of course, a big ticket item we hear about a lot. So super great to address that. A specific question we got in for Sarah Gardner was about the funding source for Iowa City's EV charging grant program. Did the city receive any grant funding to support that program, or does it rely on general fund dollars?
No, we did not receive grant funding for it. We're really fortunate. I have to say, one of the things I love about living in the city that I do is that when it adopted its climate action plan, it also passed an emergency levy that allowed us to dedicate a certain percentage of the funds coming into our general fund specifically to climate programs. And we saw this opportunity as aligning very well with our climate goals and also our equity goals. So it's a little wonky, but effectively, yes, it's paid out of our general fund dollars.
Got you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Should be super helpful for cities trying to replicate it. The final question that we have time for today is about the direct pay tax credits, which we're still waiting on that final guidance from the EPA for. But have you seen a charging plan that details how to unlock the direct pay tax credits for EVs and EVSE, or procurement model procurement language, or things like that?
I mean, we are watching really closely as the IRS guidance comes out. And I think when it comes to the vehicle side, elective pay or direct pay is something that's going to really help unlock, I think, local government fleet ownership as well as, consumer uptake of electric vehicles. Uh, but on the local government side, that's going to be much clearer in terms of how elective pay or direct pay is used for purchasing vehicles. On the EV charging side, the sticking point right now is sort of where will that tax credit qualify? And that's not clear yet. And that's what the EPA and the IRS are working on. We hope that that guidance will be out really soon, and then that will help local governments identify where that tax credit is eligible and then how to make use of it. But the general idea is that local governments and other non-tax paying entities will be able to treat their investment in vehicles or infrastructure as if they do have tax liability, and that tax credit will be treated as an overpayment in taxes. And when those local governments file their taxes the following year, whatever qualified investments they've made in vehicles and infrastructure, that tax credit value will be returned to them in a check from the federal government. So it's important to recognize that there'll be a delay on when that money comes in, and that we're still unclear on exactly what will qualify. But stay tuned. That information should be coming early next year.
Thanks so much, Stan. Yes, definitely always difficult to talk about federal funding before it's out. I know that feeling well, but appreciate you giving your best effort to touch on it as it's on a lot of people's minds. So with that, I wanted to thank the speakers for their time as we are about to hit that 3 o'clock mark. And I wanted to thank the audience for joining and for your participation. We hope this webinar was super resourceful for you and demonstrates that our industry is working to tackle this next hurdle in national electrification. We'll be sure to send out a recording of this webinar to all who registered and emails of the speakers if they're comfortable, so that you guys can continue collaborating with them and getting their insights. I also invite you to stick around after and view the post-show slides to check out EC resources and upcoming events. And I wish you a safe and joyful holiday season. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alyssa.